Do you think that it's positively impacted your life, or is it just the fact that there are so many people around who are influenced by it that are like, "Hey, yeah, 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 this was so good," and don't get me wrong, intellectually, it's brilliant. Intellectually, what they're writing is admirable, which is more than likely why they were afforded the opportunity to be as popular as many of them were, and probably more of them should have been, and probably there was a bigger drive, or there was a large drive then, to try and promote more of those bands and musicians who were a part of that style. I find it's the subject matter. The subject matter is very different. It's admirable and it's helpful, but as a pop culture item, is it really a positive influence? Because the subject matter is very personal in a way that is maybe more exhausting than any other subject.
You make a good point about that, Greg, because sometimes it's a case where the aesthetic of a group may not match the sound. And I think what made the Smashing Pumpkins very unique is that they're like an alternative rock band, but unlike, correct me if I'm wrong, but like a lot of the bands at that time were sort of influenced by punk and sort of alternative music. But the Smashing Pumpkins, I've read like on Wikipedia that they got more of their influence from classic rock bands like Rush, and sort of like, again, we're talking about like hair metal bands, like just metal bands and classic rock, and using that to influence their style of alternative music. It was as heavy as the other stuff, but you could definitely notice that difference in sound where like something as creative and alternative as any other albums could be influenced by things that are not necessarily like the things that other bands were influenced by. The Smashing Pumpkins, you could definitely hear that in their music, even though they may sound like other bands at that time. But the guitar influence and the sort of large production and that kind of, yeah, that sort of goth aesthetic, they're very. It's to this day they're a very creative band that way.
Do you guys think that it's appropriate that you have been exposed to that subject matter, probably before you were even old enough to understand what it was? So the subject matter, to what I'm referring to, is the anxiety, the stress, the hardship, the difficulties. Do you think that it's appropriate that at a young age you were and have been exposed to that before you developed the cognitive ability to even understand what it is?
I mean, I think, I mean, obviously you can't really control what you listen to or what you're influenced by. I mean, when you put it that way, I mean, when you listen to that music for the first time, be it Smashing Pumpkins or Linkin Park, you see it as a completely different thing. It may not make sense to you at a young age, but again, as you get older, you understand where that anxiety and that angst comes from. Again, it doesn't make sense to you when you're younger. You just see it as something different and as something you could relate to. It's like, oh, they're sort of angry and depressed, and like as a teenager, it's like, oh, I'm, like angry and depressed about things, and you just see it as something you could rage to or be angsty to, but then you appreciate it more and realize it may have not been something that you would like or have been comfortable listening to when you're younger, but you benefit from that because it sort of shapes your taste in music and how you approach music and sound. And I think listening to Linkin Park, even though they're primarily a rock band, just the types of sounds that they experiment with sort of allowed me to sort of expand on my taste in music and to explore other bands using their influence as a template.
Mike?
Well said, Arjun. For me, though, I mean, you raise a good point, Greg. Again, though, I mean, as I was a younger person and listening to that music, again, I wasn't really paying attention to the lyrics. It was more of the sound and the music coming out. Like, I mean, here was these bands, and like, this was music that you'd never heard of. Again, we were coming out of an 80's generation where you had the Depeche Modes and the New Orders and the U2s and the early Guns N' Roses and the Motley Crues, where that was a pretty specific genre, those bands. And I mean, you had this, like they call it the Seattle sound, right? Or this music explosion, all these bands come out of there, and it kind of spoke volumes of our generation and stuff. It kind of, like, again, it defined it, like, again, people from the 80's and the 70's, even the 60's, like they all had their sort of defining moment in history and in time on the musical spectrum, and again, that we were very lucky to be privy of that.
Good point. Yeah, because like the bar chord, right? Hearing a bar chord played through a modern amplifier cabinet with distortion on it, with modern electric guitars and equipment played heavily, was a new sound, and it was actually recordable. So you could play 3 chords, EBA, heavily distorted at a loud volume in a studio, and we had the ability to record it and make it so it recorded in a way that it sounded good. It sounded potent, like it's supposed to sound. And so you didn't really hear that much before, right? The 80's hair bands, they had guitar to them, and they had that. I use the word finite more as like a pointed description as opposed to longevity and such, but like they had this each note almost sounded independent of the next note.
Yeah.
And although they were played very well, and they obviously progressed and worked well together, and I'm not fucking getting into conspiracy theories of pre-designed music. This note should be played after that note in that kind of way. But those hair bands, you could distinguish between, notes and chords and sounds relatively easily. Whereas, Nirvana or once alternative music hit, I mean, you have this power sound that had those tones in it, but those tones aren't as clean, but they're cleaner. Like, I find the ringing, the ability of the style of play with alternative music, I find the ringing of a note, like how long it lasts, is its best quality. Whereas if you listen to 80's hair bands, we hear them hit a note, the note is almost dead once they're done, and they move on to the next note. But in a sequence, it still sounds great. Don't get me wrong. I mean, yes. But what is it? Is it Smells Like Teen Spirit? Like the start of it, like where he just hits those 2 notes.
Like the opening part.
And then he hits 2 notes. What are those 2 notes? Can you play it, Arjun? Can you find it there?
Smells like. Yeah, hang on.
Smells Like Teen Spirit. He hits those 2 notes. I know the 2 notes. Vocally, I cannot impersonate them, so I'm not going to embarrass myself and try. But I'm sure, Michael, you know the 2. So they're not as cleanly played, but the way that they ring, they're the only 2 notes that he plays. So it goes, it has the opening progression of chords, And then when it goes quiet, he hits those two notes.
Down and out, down out, down,
Keep going.
down out,
That's
Keep
it.
going. Keep going. Keep going. And then no, you're still missing it here. I'm gonna give it to you.
Hang on, I got.
You got it?
Hang on, one sec. Now, let me know if you guys can hear this. One sec.
The part that I'm talking right there.
You hear it?
Right there, Mike. Can you hear that?
Yeah.
Those two notes is what I'm talking about.
Okay.
Which, for me, are probably the... Yeah.
Here, one more time.
That's the song to me. It's interesting. The song to you might be the power chords. See, the song to me is more about those, just the way that those two notes ring. And so that period of music did that exceptionally well. And I find now that my ear is it's conditioned and trained to look for those types of things. And, you know, the types of bands that I've appreciated and liked and types of music from a wide range of styles since then, I think has been better than it would have been had I not heard them. Had Nirvana not been popular.